The first time the most dangerous man in South Korea spoke to me, he didn't ask for my name. He wiped a stranger's blood off my cheek with a white silk handkerchief, looked up at his 12 armed guards standing in the pouring rain, and said, "Burn the block down if anyone looks at her twice." I was just a broke art teacher. I was only trying to stop a 6-year-old boy from choking to death in the snow. I had absolutely no idea that saving the Ice King's heir was about to make me, Stephanie Jones, the sole obsession of the Seoul underworld. The boy wasn't moving. That was the first thing I noticed. It was a brutal, bone-chilling Saturday afternoon in January. The kind of cold that bites straight through the soles of your shoes and makes your lungs ache with every breath. I was sitting on a frosted iron bench in Riverside Park, a few yards away from the edge of the Han River. My fingers were numb, coated in black charcoal dust, as I desperately tried to sketch the barren winter trees. I was trying to draw, but all I could really see was the bright pink eviction notice sitting on my cracked kitchen counter back at my tiny, unheated apartment. I had 12,001 to my name, a portfolio of unsold canvases, and a profound, suffocating sense of invisibility. I was a black woman in a sprawling metropolis of millions, and most days I felt like a ghost. Until I looked to my left. A few yards away, sitting completely alone on the edge of a stone fountain, was a little boy. He was a stark contrast to everything around him. While I was shivering in a thrift store coat that was 3 sizes too big, he was wrapped in pristine navy blue cashmere. His boots were polished leather, untouched by the slush. He looked like a prince who had wandered away from his castle. In his small, gloved hands, he clutched a hard peppermint candy. I watched him pop it into his mouth, my charcoal pausing on the paper. I expected a nanny or a parent to come rushing out from the tree line, scolding him for sitting in the freezing cold. But the park was dead silent. Then, the quiet broke in the most terrifying way possible. The boy didn't scream. He didn't cough. He just went completely, unnervingly still. The candy had lodged directly in his windpipe. His small hands flew up, clawing frantically at his cashmere collar. His eyes went wide with absolute terror. I could see the panic vibrating through his tiny frame as his face rapidly began to shift from pale to a terrifying, bruised shade of blue. Time seemed to stop. The wind howling off the river faded into a dull roar in my ears. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I dropped my sketchbook, the charcoal shattering against the frozen concrete, and I ran. I ignored the ice seeping into my cheap boots, my feet slipping as I closed the distance between us. In that single, suspended moment, the eviction notice didn't matter. My empty bank account didn't matter. I was the only thing standing between that child and the dark, permanent void. I dropped to my knees in the snow right behind him. I spun his small body around, pressing his back flush against my chest. "I've got you," I whispered, my voice trembling but loud enough for him to hear. "I've got you, baby, hold on." I wrapped my arms around his waist, found the hollow just beneath his ribs, and performed a brutal, desperate Heimlich maneuver. One thrust. Hard. Nothing happened. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Please, God, no. I pulled back and thrust again, using every ounce of strength I had left in my freezing body. 2, 3. With a sickening pop, the peppermint candy finally dislodged, flying out of his mouth and landing with a dull thud in the pristine white snow. The boy took a massive, ragged, gasping breath. The sound of air filling his lungs was the loudest, most beautiful thing I had ever heard. His knees buckled instantly, and he collapsed backward into my lap, burying his face into my worn, damp coat. He began to weep, silent, heavy, trembling sobs that shook his entire body. I sank down fully into the snow, wrapping my arms around him to share whatever body heat I had left. I rocked him back and forth, burying my face in his dark hair, whispering over and over again that he was safe, that it was over, that I wasn't going to let him go. But we weren't safe. The real nightmare was just arriving. The heavy silence of the park was suddenly shattered by the deafening roar of V-12 engines. I looked up just in time to see 4 blacked-out, armored Maybach SUVs jump the concrete curb. They tore across the frosted grass, tearing up the earth, and slammed on their brakes in a tight semicircle right in front of the fountain. Before the tires even stopped spinning, the doors flew open. It looked like a military invasion. A dozen men in pitch-black tactical gear and tailored charcoal suits poured out of the vehicles. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized efficiency. Before I could even open my mouth to explain, rough, gloved hands grabbed my shoulders. I was ripped away from the boy with the force of a car crash. I screamed as I was thrown backward, my spine hitting the icy ground hard enough to knock the wind completely out of my lungs. I scrambled backward, gasping for air, but a heavy combat boot stepped down hard onto my ankle, pinning me to the frozen earth. The cold, unforgiving steel of a gun barrel was pressed directly to my temple. "Step away from the air," the man standing over me barked in rapid, furious Korean. His finger was curled tightly around the trigger. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak. I looked over at the boy. 2 guards were trying to pick him up, but he was fighting them like a wild animal. He was kicking, scratching, and gripping the fabric of my jeans with a desperation that broke my heart all over again. He refused to let them pull him away from me. He was screaming, but no sound was coming out. Then the temperature in the air seemed to drop another 10 degrees. The shouting stopped. The guards froze. The door to the lead Maybach slowly opened. Kang-Dae stepped out, the Ice King of Seoul. He didn't walk, he commanded the space around him. He was uncomfortably tall, his broad shoulders filling out a bespoke, obsidian-black overcoat. His face was a masterpiece of sharp angles, high cheekbones, and cold, merciless architecture. He radiated a dark, suffocating power that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He looked at his crying son, still clawing at the guards to get back to me. Then his dark, dead-eyed gaze slowly shifted down to the snow. To me, to the gun pointed at my head. He didn't offer a word of gratitude. He didn't sigh in relief that his son was alive. He didn't smile. He walked over slowly, his heavy, expensive leather shoes crunching in the snow. He waved a single finger, and the guard immediately lowered the gun and stepped back, bowing his head in total submission. Kang-Dae stood over me. He reached down, grabbing me by the upper arm, and hauled me to my feet effortlessly. His grip was like a steel vice, bruising my skin through the thick layers of my coat. He stared down at me, his eyes running over my messy hair, my cheap clothes, and the charcoal smeared across my trembling hands. It was terrifying calculation. He was assessing a threat, or perhaps evaluating a new possession. "You touched what is mine." His voice was a low, vibrating bass that settled heavy and permanent right in the center of my chest. He spoke in flawless, unaccented English. "I saved his life," I managed to choke out, my voice shaking in the freezing wind. Kang-Dae's jaw tightened. He leaned in just a fraction of an inch, close enough that I could smell the scent of expensive cedar and cold rain on his skin. "Get in the car, Stephanie Jones." Before I could process how he already knew my name, before I could fight back or scream for help, I was pushed forward into the back of the armored SUV, the heavy doors slamming shut behind me. I was officially a prisoner of the underworld. If your heart is already pounding from that park encounter, you are exactly in the right place. Welcome to Revenge Satellite, where we tell the darkest, most beautiful, high-stakes love stories. Hit that subscribe button right now before we enter the Ice King's penthouse, because you won't want to miss the dangerous game Stephanie Jones is about to play. ACT2, the Amethyst K. The drive into the heart of Seoul was suffocating. Inside the cavernous backseat of the Maybach, the silence was heavier than the armored doors locking me inside. The tinted windows turned the bright, bustling city into a blurred, dark smear. Kang-Dae sat directly across from me. He didn't look at his phone. He didn't speak to his driver. He simply sat there, his massive frame perfectly still, his dark, unreadable eyes completely fixed on me. Every time I shifted in my damp, ruined coat, his gaze tracked the movement. It was the look of a predator analyzing a new, unpredictable element in his territory. Next to me, little Jae-hoon had both of his small hands wrapped tightly around my wrist. He had buried his face against my side, exhausted by the trauma, his breathing finally evening out into a soft rhythm. I placed my charcoal-stained hand softly over his hair, protective instinct completely overriding my terror. I was terrified of the Ice King sitting across from me, but I would be damned if I let him see me shake. The SUV glided into an underground parking cavern that looked more like a high-tech military bunker. Men in dark suits lined the concrete walls, bowing instantly at a perfect 90-degree angle as our tires rolled to a stop. We took a private, glass-walled elevator up 90 floors. My ears popped twice. When the titanium doors finally slid open, I stepped out into a world that I couldn't have imagined in my wildest, most feverish dreams. This was the Ice King's fortress. The penthouse spanned the entire top floor of the Gangnam skyscraper. It was a staggering $40 million monument to wealth, isolation, and absolute control. The floors were polished black marble that reflected the Seoul's skyline pouring in through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The decor was strictly obsidian, brushed chrome, and deep, bruised amethyst. It was breathtakingly beautiful, and it was completely, utterly dead. There were no framed photographs on the walls, no stray shoes by the front door, not a single toy or child's book in sight. It didn't smell like a home. It smelled like expensive ozone, cold leather, and silence. As I stood there, snow melting off my boots onto the pristine black marble, a severe-looking older woman in a tailored gray uniform approached us. She was followed by two maids who kept their eyes glued to the floor. "Master Kang," the woman said, bowing deeply. Her eyes flicked up to me, sweeping over my thrift store coat, my natural hair, and my scuffed boots. Her lip curled just a fraction in naked disgust. "Madame Ryu," Kang-Dae's voice cut through the massive room, hard and cold. "Take my son to his wing, have the physician examine his throat, immediately." Madame Ryu stepped forward, reaching out for Jae-hoon. But the moment her perfectly manicured hands got close, the little boy violently recoiled. He scrambled behind my legs, gripping the fabric of my jeans in a white-knuckled fist, burying his face in my knees. He was trembling all over again. Madame Ryu's eyes flashed with indignation. She looked at me, her English clipped and laced with venom. "Release the young master, you filthy girl." The words hung in the cold air. The two maids behind her visibly flinched. I didn't yell. I didn't back down. I felt the heat of righteous anger flood my veins, burning away the last of the winter cold. I gently placed a hand on Jae-hoon's back to soothe him, but I kept my eyes locked dead onto the housekeeper's face. "I didn't ask to be brought here," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, slicing through the tension in the room. "I am only here because your master dragged me into this car, but since I am standing in this room, you will never speak to me like that again. Do we understand each other?" Madame Ryu gasped, her posture going rigid with shock. No one spoke back to her, and certainly no one spoke back to her in front of the boss. She turned her head, waiting for Kang-Dae to order his guards to throw me off the balcony for my insolence. Instead, Kang-Dae simply unbuttoned his heavy charcoal overcoat, his eyes burning into the side of my face. He didn't reprimand me. If anything, the sharp corner of his jaw flexed, a terrifying flicker of dark amusement crossing his features. "You heard her, Madame Ryu," Kang-Dae said softly. It was a whisper that carried the weight of a death sentence. "If you forget your place again, you will be replaced." The older woman turned pale as a sheet and bowed so low her forehead nearly touched her knees. Kang-Dae walked past her, his broad shoulder brushing against my arm. "Bring the boy to my study, Stephanie Jones. We have business to discuss." The study was located behind a set of heavy, soundproofed mahogany doors. It smelled of aged bourbon, old paper, and power. Kang-Dae walked over to a massive desk carved from a single block of dark wood. He didn't sit. He popped the gold latches on a sleek, black leather briefcase and spun it around to face me. Inside were neat, pristine stacks of $100 bills. U.S. currency. $500,000. Enough money to pay my late rent, buy my own gallery, and never worry about another eviction notice for the rest of my natural life. "My son hasn't spoken a single word in 2 years, Kang-Dae said, leaning his heavy knuckles on the desk, leaning forward until the shadows caught the sharp angles of his face. Not since he watched his mother get assassinated in the streets of Milan. He has severe selective mutism. He doesn't laugh. He doesn't cry. He is a ghost in this house. His eyes drifted to where Jae-hoon was still hiding behind my legs, his tiny fingers clutching my coat. But he wouldn't let go of you, Kang-Dae continued, his gaze rising slowly up my body until his dark eyes locked onto mine. I am a man who protects his investments. You are going to live here. You will teach him art. You will keep him calm. You will not leave this penthouse without my armed detail. That money is your first month's salary. It wasn't a job offer. It was a hostage negotiation where he held all the cards. He was buying me, just like he bought everything else in his life. I looked at the mountain of cash. I thought about the freezing apartment waiting for me across the city. Then, I looked at the terrifying, beautiful man standing over me. I reached out. I placed my charcoal-stained hand directly on the lid of the briefcase. And I slammed it shut with a sharp, violent snap. Kang-Dae didn't flinch, but his eyes narrowed to dangerous slits. I am an artist, not a possession, I told him, keeping my chin high, refusing to let him see my pulse racing at the base of my throat. You can't buy my freedom, Kang-Dae, and you can't buy your son's healing with stacks of paper. I stepped closer to the desk, closing the gap between us until the air crackled with thick, heavy tension. I don't want your money, but I will stay. Not because you ordered me to. I'll stay because this boy is freezing to death inside this beautiful, empty cage you've built, and he needs someone who isn't made of ice. Silence, suffocating, heavy, absolute silence. I had just insulted the most feared syndicate boss in Asia, inside his own fortress. I waited for the guards to rush in. I waited for his wrath. But it never came. Something flickered deep behind Kang-Dae's dark eyes. The ice cracked. It was a microscopic shift, but I felt it. For the first time in 10 years, someone had looked the Ice King in the eye and told him no. That night, I refused to let Jae-hoon sleep in his assigned bedroom. It looked like a sterile hospital ward. Instead, I sat him down on the floor of the massive, empty living room. I unpacked my cheap canvas tote bag, pulling out my worn sketchbooks, my vibrant acrylic paints, and a handful of thick brushes. Madame Ryu hovered in the doorway, horrified as I began tapping large sheets of heavy paper directly onto the $40 million Venetian plaster walls. You are ruining the master's estate, she hissed, stepping forward to rip the paper down. Let her, the voice came from the shadows of the hallway. Kang-Dae emerged into the dim light. He had stripped off his suit jacket and tie. His crisp white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to reveal thick, corded forearms heavily marked with faded, violent scars. Madame Ryu evaporated into the background. Kang-Dae didn't approach us. He just leaned his massive shoulder against the archway, crossing his arms over his chest, and watched. I turned my back to him, focusing entirely on the little boy. I squeezed out pools of bright, warm colors onto a wooden palette, sunflower yellows, deep crimson reds, vibrant cerulean blues. Colors that had likely never existed inside this dark, Gothic penthouse. I painted a sunrise, a massive, sweeping, fiery sunrise right across the wall. I handed a small, soft brush to Jae-hoon. He stared at it for a long time. Then, with a trembling hand, he dipped it into the bright yellow paint. He didn't paint the paper. He reached out and dabbed a messy streak of yellow directly onto his own pristine, cashmere-covered knee. He looked up at me, his wide eyes terrified, waiting to be scolded, waiting for the punishment. Instead, I dipped my own thumb into the red paint, and I playfully swiped it right across the tip of my own nose. Jae-hoon's eyes widened, and then the corners of his mouth twitched. A tiny, fragile smile broke across his face. From the shadows of the hallway, I heard the faintest sound, a sharp intake of breath. I looked over my shoulder. Kang-Dae was still leaning against the wall, but his posture had completely changed. He was staring at his son's smile like he was looking at a miracle. And then, slowly, his dark, heavy gaze shifted from the boy to me. He looked at the paint on my nose, my messy hair, and the fierce, protective defiance still burning in my eyes. The Ice King wasn't just watching me anymore. He was studying me. And as I held his gaze in the dim, quiet penthouse, I realized with a sudden, terrifying jolt to my heart that the most dangerous man in Seoul was already beginning to thaw. The cage door is locked, but the Ice King is already losing control. Do you think Stephanie Jones should have taken the $500,000 or was turning it down the ultimate power move? Sound off in the comments right now. If you're completely hooked on this dark, slow-burn romance, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to Revenge Satellite. We're just getting started. A week passed inside the Amethyst cage. The penthouse was designed to be a fortress of silent, unbreakable routines, but from the moment I refused that briefcase of cash, I stopped playing by their rules. I completely ignored the icy glares of Madame Ryu and the terrified whispers of the maids. I kept my own erratic artist hours. My entire world narrowed down to the little boy who trailed behind me like a shadow. Jae-hoon was still mute, but the crushing, terrified tension in his tiny shoulders had begun to loosen. I replaced the classical music piped through the penthouse speakers with old-school R&B and jazz. I covered the pristine Venetian plaster walls of his playroom with heavy canvas drop cloths, turning the sterile space into a chaotic, vibrant sanctuary of creation. And through it all, Kang-Dae was a constant, looming presence. He was like a panther packing the perimeter of his territory. He would leave before dawn in a fleet of armored SUVs and return late into the night, bringing the sharp scent of cold rain, expensive cedar, and something darker, something metallic and dangerous, back into the penthouse with him. He never interrupted my lessons with Jae-hoon, but I could always feel his eyes on me. I would catch him standing in the shadowy archways, his tie loosened, watching me wash my paintbrushes in the sink. The heavy, unreadable weight of his stare made my skin prickle with a heat I refused to acknowledge. The real shift, the moment the ice truly began to crack, happened in the dead of night. It was 2:00 a.m. The sprawling city of Seoul was a glittering sea of neon lights far below us, but inside the penthouse, the air was pitch black and suffocatingly quiet. I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, torn between the terrifying reality of my captivity and the strange, fierce protective bond I was forming with Jae-hoon. I slipped out of my guest room, walking barefoot across the freezing black marble floors toward the massive kitchen. The only light came from the blue glow of the city filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I moved quietly, pulling a bag of dark roast coffee beans from the pantry. I didn't want the mild, floral tea the maids prepared. I needed something bitter and grounding. I stood at the island, waiting for the espresso machine to hiss into life, when the hairs on the back of my neck suddenly stood straight up. I wasn't alone. A shadow detached itself from the darkness of the hallway. Kang-Dae. He moved without making a single sound, stepping into the dim, blue light of the kitchen. He had stripped off his suit jacket and tie. He wore dark slacks and a crisp white dress shirt, unbuttoned halfway down his chest. The sleeves were rolled up past his elbows, revealing the edge of a jagged silver scar wrapping around his thick forearm, a brutal reminder of how he maintained his throne. In his right hand, he held a heavy crystal glass with 2 fingers of amber whiskey. He didn't turn on the overhead lights. He simply walked to the opposite side of the expansive marble island and stopped, his massive frame radiating heat in the cool room. He watched me pour the pitch-black liquid into a ceramic mug. "You don't sleep," he stated. It wasn't a question. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated right through the marble counter and into my bare feet. I didn't flinch. I slowly slid the mug across the cool surface toward him, turning back to pour a second cup for myself. "Neither do you," I replied softly, the silence of the room wrapping around us like a heavy blanket. He looked down at the steaming mug of black coffee, then slowly brought his dark, predatory gaze up to meet mine. The moonlight caught the sharp, dangerous angles of his cheekbones. "Why do you paint Stephanie Jones?" It was the very first time he had spoken my full name since the day he dragged me into his car. The way it rolled off his tongue, deep, precise, and laced with an intoxicating, possessive edge, sent a sudden, violent rush of heat straight to my chest. My breath caught in my throat. I gripped the edge of my coffee mug, letting the ceramic burn my palms to ground myself. I took a slow sip, refusing to break eye contact. "Because the world is ugly," I whispered, my voice betraying a slight tremor. "It's violent and it's cold, and it takes things from people who don't deserve to lose them. I paint because I like having the power to change it, even if it's just on a piece of canvas." Kang-Dae didn't blink. He took a step closer to the edge of the island, closing the distance between us. The scent of bourbon and cedar washed over me. His eyes slowly dropped from my eyes down to my lips, lingering there for a second too long. The air between us suddenly felt impossibly thick, suffocating, and lethally dangerous. He was a man used to absolute control. He commanded armies. He destroyed bloodlines. But right then, in the dark, standing mere inches from me, I saw the control fracturing. His chest rose and fell with a heavy breath, and for one terrifying, electric second, I thought he was going to reach across the marble and pull me against him. The midnight tension in that kitchen is absolutely electric. Have you ever felt that kind of magnetic pull towards someone you know is entirely dangerous? Drop a fire in the comments if you want Kang-Dae to finally cross that line. And if you are loving the slow burn romance on Revenge Satellite, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on the bell. The Ice King is breaking his own rules, and you need to see what happens next. The kiss didn't happen that night, but the invisible wall between us had been permanently shattered. The real breakthrough came the next afternoon. I was sitting cross-legged on the tarp-covered floor of Jae-hoon's room. We were making a spectacular, glorious mess. I had decided to abandon the brushes entirely. I was teaching Jae-hoon how to finger paint, plunging our hands into jars of thick, vibrant acrylics and smearing them directly onto a massive canvas spread across the floor. Jae-hoon was covered in cerulean blue and bright yellow. He was intensely focused, mixing the colors together, his small brow furrowed in concentration. I dipped my hands into a jar of bright crimson red. "Look at this," I said, catching his attention. I clapped my hands together, sending a tiny spray of red paint flying through the air. A few droplets landed directly on his nose. Jae-hoon froze. His eyes went wide, staring at my completely red hands. For a second, I panicked, terrified that the sudden movement had triggered a traumatic memory of the violence he had witnessed. But then, his mouth opened. His tiny shoulders began to shake. A sound bubbled up from deep inside his chest. It started as a small, breathy giggle, and then, like a dam breaking, it erupted. Jae-hoon laughed. It was a real, loud, thunderous belly laugh that bounced off the walls and filled the sterile hallway with pure, unfiltered joy. He fell backward onto the tarp, clutching his stomach, laughing so hard no sound came out for a moment before he gasped for air and laughed again. I started laughing with him, tears of overwhelming relief prickling the corners of my eyes. Down the hall, the heavy, soundproof doors of the private study burst open. The sound of a heavy crystal whiskey glass hitting the hardwood floor and shattering into 100 pieces echoed down the corridor. Rapid, frantic footsteps rushed toward the room. Kang-Dae appeared in the doorway, completely undone. He was breathing heavily, his eyes scanning the room for a threat. The cold, calculating Mafia boss was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified father who had just heard a sound he thought was buried forever. He saw Jae-hoon on the floor, covered in paint, laughing at the ceiling. Kang-Dae slowly walked into the room. He waved off the two heavily armed guards who had rushed up behind him, dismissing them with a single, trembling flick of his wrist. He didn't care about the wet paint covering the floor. He dropped straight to his knees on the tarp, ruining a custom $5,000 suit without a second thought. He just stared at his smiling son, his chest heaving, his dark eyes shining with an emotion he was desperately trying to suppress. Jae-hoon sat up, looked at his father, and gave him a bright, paint-stained smile. Without thinking, I reached out. There was a smudge of bright yellow paint on Kang-Dae's sharp, rigid jawline. My fingers, stained with red and blue, brushed softly against his warm skin to wipe it away. Kang-Dae's breath hitched violently. His eyes went completely dark, flashing from the boy to me. He didn't pull away from my touch. He didn't flinch. Instead, as my thumb traced the line of his jaw, he leaned into my palm just a fraction of an inch. His heavy eyelids fluttered shut for one terrifyingly vulnerable second. He let out a ragged exhale, pressing his cheek against my hand, letting me hold him in a world where no one was allowed to touch him. When his eyes snapped open again, they were fierce, burning, and completely stripped of their icy armor. He wasn't looking at a captive anymore. He wasn't looking at an art teacher. He was looking at the woman who had just breathed life back into his dead world. The Ice King just dropped to his knees. We have officially reached the point of no return. What do you think Kang-Dae is going to do to the people who try to take Stephanie Jones away from him now? Let me know your theories in the comments. The rival syndicates are about to make a deadly mistake. Stick around for Act 4, and if you haven't yet, subscribe to Revenge Satellite to catch every thrilling moment. In the Seoul underworld, secrets are currency, and they never stay buried for long. Word had begun to spread across the rival syndicates like a slow-burning fuse. The untouchable Ice King, the man who had ruled the city's darkest corners with absolute, emotionless precision for a decade, suddenly had a blind spot. A weakness. Rumors whispered through the VIP rooms of Gangnam and the shipping yards of Incheon. They whispered about an American, a black art teacher living deep inside his impenetrable fortress. I didn't know I was being hunted. I was too consumed by the quiet, beautiful life we were building inside that penthouse. It was a gloomy Thursday afternoon. The sky above the city was the color of bruised iron, threatening a torrential downpour. I had run out of the specific heavyweight, cold-pressed canvases I needed for Jae-hoon's next project. Kang-Dae was reluctant to let me leave, his jaw tight as he stood by the elevator, but he eventually nodded. He sent me out in a heavily armored SUV, flanked by 4 of his most elite, stone-faced guards. We drove down into the sprawling, neon-lit labyrinth of the city's art district. The rain began to fall as we pulled up to a narrow, cobblestone alleyway that led to a specialty supply shop. The alley was too tight for the massive SUV, so the lead guard, a broad-shouldered man named Choi, signaled for me to walk the remaining 50 yards. 2 guards flanked me closely, their eyes constantly scanning the rain-slicked rooftops and fire escapes. I pulled the collar of my coat up against the biting wind, clutching my empty canvas tote bag. The alley smelled of wet pavement, ozone, and old brick. We were exactly halfway to the shop's entrance when the trap snapped shut. Without warning, a battered white delivery van violently reversed into the mouth of the alley behind us, its tires screeching against the wet cobblestone. It slammed directly into the side of our armored SUV, completely blocking our only exit. Before I could even gasp, the side doors of the van flew open. The alley erupted into absolute chaos. 8 men dressed in dark, nondescript clothing poured out into the rain. They weren't common street thugs. They moved with lethal, coordinated military precision. They were soldiers of the White Lotus, the syndicate that had been bleeding territory to Kang-Dae for years. They were armed with heavy steel pipes, telescoping batons, and serrated switchblades. Choi yelled a command I didn't understand. He shoved me hard behind a set of rusted metal dumpsters, drawing his concealed weapon in a fluid blur of motion. But they were ambushed from the other side, too. The heavy metal doors of the abandoned buildings lining the alley kicked open, and more men flooded the narrow space. The sound of gunfire echoed off the brick walls, deafening and sharp. The air instantly filled with the acrid stench of gunpowder and copper. I crouched in the filthy, freezing water pooling behind the dumpster, pressing my hands over my ears. My heart was hammering so violently against my ribs I thought it might shatter them. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for the sirens, praying for a way out. Suddenly, a heavy hand grabbed a fistful of my jacket collar. I screamed as I was dragged out from behind the metal bin, my knees scraping agonizingly over the wet, jagged cobblestones. A massive thug with a jagged scar running down his throat yanked me roughly to my feet, pinning my arms behind my back. He pressed the cold, flat blade of a switchblade against the pulse point of my neck. He sneered down at me, his breath smelling of stale tobacco and adrenaline. He spoke in broken, heavily accented English, spit flying from his lips. "Let's see how much the king pays to get his new pet back." He didn't get to finish the sentence. Above the sound of the pouring rain and the shouts of the fighting men, A deafening, monstrous roar tore through the alley. It sounded like a jet engine. A sleek, matte black motorcycle launched off the main street, going completely airborne over the hood of the crushed white van. It hit the wet cobblestones, skidding sideways in a spray of water and sparks. The rider didn't even wait for the bike to stop moving. He vaulted off the machine, tearing off a black helmet and tossing it aside. It was Kang-Dae. He hadn't waited for backup. He hadn't sent an extraction team. He had come himself. This wasn't the quiet, restrained billionaire who drank black coffee in my kitchen at 2 a.m. This wasn't the gentle father who ruined his suits kneeling in wet paint for his son. This was the monster they told ghost stories about. This was the Ice King. He didn't draw a gun. He didn't need one. He stepped into the chaotic fray with a terrifying, brutal efficiency. He moved like a shadow, ducking a swinging steel pipe and driving his fist directly into an attacker's throat with a sickening crunch. He dismantled the White Lotus soldiers with his bare hands, breaking limbs and shattering jaws in a blinding display of lethal, unbridled rage. The thug holding me hostage panicked. He tightened his grip on my hair, the blade pressing harder against my skin. Kang-Dae saw it. Time seemed to slow down. He locked eyes with the man holding me, his dark gaze burning with a promise of absolute, inescapable death. Kang-Dae grabbed a steel pipe dropped by a fallen enemy. He didn't hesitate. He hurled it through the rain like a javelin. It struck the thug directly in the center of his chest, knocking the wind completely out of his lungs. The man's grip loosened. I ripped myself away, stumbling backward into the brick wall, gasping for air. Within 90 seconds, the alley was completely silent, save for the heavy, relentless drumming of the rain and the groans of the broken men writhing on the ground. Kang-Dae stood in the center of the carnage. His white dress shirt was soaked through, clinging to the heavy muscles of his back, splattered with dark crimson blood that wasn't his own. He was breathing heavily, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. He slowly turned to face me. I was backed against the cold, wet brick, trembling uncontrollably, staring at the sheer, terrifying violence he was capable of unleashing. I expected him to be cold. I expected him to be furious that I had stepped out of line. Instead, he dropped a bloody switchblade onto the pavement. He crossed the alley in 3 massive strides, ignoring his bleeding guards, and fell to his knees directly in front of me. His large, warm hands grabbed my face, his thumbs frantically wiping the rain and grime from my cheeks. "Stephanie," he choked out, his voice completely raw, stripped of all its commanding authority. "Are you hurt? Did they cut you?" I shook my head, unable to form words, my teeth chattering from the adrenaline and the freezing rain. He let out a ragged, agonizing exhale. He stood up, wrapping his massive overcoat around my shivering shoulders, completely enveloping me in his scent. He scooped me up into his arms effortlessly, carrying me out of the blood-soaked alleyway and into the pouring rain. The Ice King just turned into a one-man army to protect Stephanie Jones. Have you ever read a scene with this much intense, protective energy? If Kang-Dae's brutal rescue has your heart racing, make sure you smash that like button and leave a comment down below telling me your favorite part of the fight. And don't forget to subscribe to Revenge Satellite. The tension is about to boil over. The ride back to the penthouse was a blur. By the time we stepped out of the private elevator, the adrenaline had completely crashed, leaving me weak, exhausted, and fiercely aware of the man standing beside me. We bypassed the main living areas and went straight to his private master suite. The massive, black marble bathroom was suffocatingly quiet. The only sound was the running water of the sink as the steam began to fog the massive mirrors. I had kicked off my ruined boots. I was standing barefoot on the cold tile, a damp white towel trembling in my hands. Kang-Dae sat on the edge of the massive sunken bathtub. He had stripped off his ruined suit jacket and his soaked, blood-stained shirt. His chest was a map of old scars, but there was a new one. A deep, jagged slice ran horizontally across his left collarbone, bleeding sluggishly down his perfect, sculpted chest. He had taken a blade meant for one of his men. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I stepped between his spread knees. I pressed the warm, damp towel against the cut. He hissed slightly, the muscles in his abdomen flexing hard under my touch. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice echoing faintly off the marble walls. I carefully wiped away the blood, my fingertips inadvertently brushing against the hot, bare skin of his chest. Kang-Dae stared straight ahead, his jaw locked tight. "I should send you away," he said. His voice was a ragged, dangerous whisper that sent a shiver straight down my spine. "I should put you on a private jet tonight, back to America, back to a life where you don't have to watch men bleed on the pavement." I stopped wiping. I lowered the towel, looking down into his dark, tortured eyes. He wasn't trying to control me anymore. He was terrified. The Ice King was terrified that his dark world was going to destroy the only light he had left. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to hold his gaze. "Are you going too?" I asked softly. "Are you going to send me away, Kang-Dae?" He stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. The air between us grew impossibly heavy, charged with all the unspoken words, the late-night coffee, the shared silence, and the desperate, violent rescue in the rain. Suddenly, he reached out. His large hands gripped my waist with a sudden, possessive strength that sent a shockwave straight to my core. He pulled me forward, flushing my body directly against his bare, burning chest. "If I do," he growled, tilting his head back to look up at me, his eyes burning with an intense, consuming fire. "If I send you away, Stephanie, I will burn Seoul to the ground just to find my way back to you." He didn't wait for my answer. He didn't give me a chance to breathe. He pulled me down, his mouth crashing against mine. It was brutal. It was desperate. It was completely, utterly claiming. There was nothing gentle about it. It was an explosion of pent-up terror, relief, and undeniable primal need. His hands tangled fiercely in my natural hair, holding me in place as his lips moved against mine, demanding everything I had to give. I dropped the bloody towel onto the marble floor. I wrapped my arms around his thick neck, threading my fingers through his damp hair, kissing him back with the exact same ferocious, desperate energy. I tasted the rain on his skin, the faint metallic tang of blood, and the intoxicating, overwhelming essence of the man who had just risked his entire empire to keep me safe. It was a promise signed in blood and adrenaline. The last wall between us hadn't just cracked, it had been completely obliterated. The broke art teacher and the terrifying Ice King of Seoul were entirely, irrevocably bound together. And the underworld was about to pay the price. That kiss was everything we have been waiting for. The slow burn is officially over, and the flames have been ignited. But you know, in a Mafia romance, a moment of peace never lasts long. How do you think the White Lotus syndicate will retaliate? Drop your predictions in the comments below. Stick around, because we are heading straight into Act 5, where Stephanie Jones is going to face high society and prove she is no one's pawn. Hit subscribe to Revenge Satellite right now, so you don't miss the climax of this incredible story. ACT 5, the High Society Humiliation. There is an ironclad, unspoken rule in the Seoul underworld. Absolute power must not only be held, it must be performed. The annual Syndicate Masquerade Ball was the ultimate stage for that performance. Held in the cavernous, gold-leafed ballroom of the Imperial Hotel, it was a gathering of the wealthiest, most ruthless criminal families in Asia. It was a place where empires were built, alliances were forged in blood, and enemies were destroyed over crystal flutes of vintage champagne. 2 days before the ball, the tension in the penthouse was thick enough to cut with a knife. I was standing in the shadows of the hallway, listening as Kang-Dae's most trusted advisor, a scarred, elderly man named Elder Park, argued with him in the private study. "You cannot bring her, Master Kang," the old man urged, his voice tight with disrespect. "She is an American, a black woman, an art teacher with no bloodline, no wealth, and no standing. To parade her in front of the White Lotus and the other families is a sign of weakness. You need a prominent Korean heiress on your arm to show the factions your empire is secure." There was a terrifyingly long pause. Then, the sound of Kang-Dae's heavy fist slamming down onto the mahogany desk echoed like a gunshot. "She is my choice." Kang-Dae's voice was a lethal, vibrating bass that made the floorboards tremble. She saved my heir. She bled for this family. She is the only woman who will ever stand beside me. If you or anyone else in my inner circle questions my decision again, Elder Park, I will cut out your tongue and serve it to the dogs. Are we clear?" The advisor sputtered, bowing so low I could hear the rustle of his suit fabric. "Yes, Master Kang." Kang-Dae didn't just want me to attend the ball. He wanted me to conquer it. He didn't listen to a single word of his advisor's protests. Instead, he had a dress flown in directly from a private atelier in Milan. On the night of the ball, I stood completely still in the center of the master suite as 3 terrified stylists pinned the final alterations. The gown was a masterpiece. It was made of heavy, custom-dyed ruby-red silk that draped flawlessly against my dark skin. It was backless, sweeping the floor in a dramatic train, leaving my shoulders completely bare. I looked at myself in the floor-to-ceiling mirror and barely recognized the broke, freezing art teacher from Riverside Park. The heavy oak door clicked open. The stylists immediately dropped their pins, bowed deeply, and practically sprinted out of the room. Kang-Dae stepped inside. He was wearing a bespoke, midnight black tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders to lethal perfection. A black silk mask rested in his hand. He stopped dead in his tracks the moment he saw me. The terrifying, cold Mafia boss completely vanished, replaced by a man staring at a goddess. He walked slowly across the thick carpet, his dark eyes burning with a heat that made my pulse hammer wildly against my ribs. He stopped right behind me, our eyes locked in the mirror. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a velvet box. Inside rested a necklace made of flawless, heavy, cascading diamonds. He didn't ask for permission. He stepped flush against my back, the heat of his chest radiating through the thin silk of my dress. He reached around my neck, the rough calluses of his fingers brushing against my sensitive skin, and secured the clasp. It wasn't just jewelry. It was a collar of absolute protection, a multi-million-dollar warning to the underworld. "You aren't just attending this ball, Stephanie Jones," he whispered, his lips brushing against the shell of my ear, sending a violent shiver down my spine. "You are going to own it, and anyone who looks at you without reverence will answer to me." The Ice King is not playing any games. He is putting a crown on Stephanie Jones before they even walk through the door. If you love a man who loudly and proudly claims his woman against all the odds, drop a crown emoji crown in the comments. And if you are absolutely living for this high-stakes Cinderella transformation, hit that like button and subscribe to Revenge Satellite right now. You do not want to miss what happens when they step onto the ballroom floor. When we walked into the grand ballroom of the Imperial Hotel, the music literally stopped. I am not exaggerating. A 12-piece classical orchestra was playing a sweeping waltz, but as the massive, gilded double doors swung open and Kang-Dae stepped inside with my hand resting securely in the crook of his arm, the conductor faltered. The violins squeaked to a halt. Hundreds of masked faces turned toward us in absolute, stunned unison. The silence was deafening, and then the whispers began. They were vicious, cutting, and entirely aimed at me. I could feel the venomous stares raking over my dark skin, my natural hair, and the blinding diamonds resting against my collarbone. I felt a momentary spike of panic, a desperate urge to turn around and run back to the safety of the armored SUV. But I squeezed Kang-Dae's tailored bicep. I lifted my chin, pulled my shoulders back, and walked down the grand staircase like I owned every single brick of the hotel. For the first hour, it was a flawless performance. Men who commanded armies of thugs bowed respectfully to Kang-Dae, their eyes nervously flicking to me before quickly looking away, terrified of his wrath. But a viper's nest will always strike when it smells an outsider. Midway through the evening, Kang-Dae was cornered by a highly influential, corrupt politician. He gave me a look that said, "Don't move," stepping just 10 feet away to entertain the man's nervous groveling. I was standing near a towering, intricately carved ice sculpture, holding a flute of sparkling water, when the temperature around me seemed to shift. A woman approached me. She was wearing a silver mask, a gown dripping in genuine pearls, and an aura of pure, unfiltered malice. It was Jae, the daughter of the White Lotus boss. the exact same faction that had tried to butcher me in the alleyway. She was flanked by 4 massive, heavily armed bodyguards trying to blend into the crowd. She stopped right in front of me, her eyes sweeping me up and down with naked disgust. "How quaint," she purred in flawless English, her voice carrying loudly enough for the surrounding elite guests to hear. "The Ice King brought a stray dog to the palace. Tell me, do you even know which fork to use for the caviar, or do you just eat out of a bowl on the floor?" The surrounding guests went entirely silent, stepping back, waiting to see if the American would break. They expected me to cry. They expected me to run to Kang-Dae, begging for protection. Without a word, Jae deliberately tilted her crystal glass forward. A wave of dark, vintage red wine splashed directly onto the bodice of my custom Milan gown. The crimson liquid soaked instantly into the expensive silk, ruining the dress in a matter of seconds. Jae let out a sickly sweet, mocking little laugh. "Oh my," she sneered, holding her empty glass up. "I'm so incredibly sorry. I thought you were the help. Why don't you be a good girl, go back to the kitchen and fetch me a clean towel?" The entire ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath. The silence was suffocating. I looked down at the ruined silk. I had survived empty bank accounts. I had survived freezing winters. I had survived a gun pointed directly at my temple in the snow. I was not going to break over spilled wine and a spoiled Mafia princess. I didn't cry. I didn't run. I calmly set my flute of water down on a passing waiter's tray. I turned back to Jae, looked her dead in her mocking eyes, raised my hand, and slapped her completely across the face. The crack of my palm, connecting with her cheek, echoed through the cavernous ballroom like a gunshot. The heiress shrieked, stumbling backward in her stiletto heels, her silver mask knocked completely askew. She gasped in absolute, unadulterated shock, clutching her rapidly reddening cheek. Instantly, the ballroom erupted into chaos. The 4 White Lotus bodyguards behind her surged forward. They ripped their suit jackets open, drawing heavy, black semi-automatic weapons, aiming them directly at my chest. I heard the terrifying, synchronized click of the safeties being switched off. I closed my eyes, bracing for the impact. But before a single trigger could be pulled, a massive, terrifying shadow eclipsed the room. Kang-Dae didn't just step in front of me. At his unseen, silent signal, 50 of his own elite syndicate men who had been blending seamlessly into the crowd as waiters, guests, and valets, materialized out of thin air. 50 guns were drawn in a fraction of a second. Red laser sights painted the chests and foreheads of the White Lotus guards, the White Lotus boss, and the trembling heiress. The room was 3 seconds away from an absolute, historic bloodbath. Kang-Dae stood directly in front of me, shielding my body entirely with his massive frame. He didn't yell. He didn't scream. He spoke with a quiet, lethal, vibrating authority that made the heavy crystal chandeliers above us tremble. "Look very closely at the woman you just disrespected," Kang-Dae said to the terrified, shaking heiress. His voice sliced through the heavy, silent air like a serrated blade. "She is not the help. She is the future matriarch of my empire. If anyone in this room breathes her name with anything less than absolute, crawling reverence, your entire bloodline ends tonight." No one moved. No one dared to even breathe. Kang-Dae didn't ask for an apology. He didn't need one. He turned around, completely ignoring the guns pointed at his back. He took my shaking hand in his, lifted it to his lips, and kissed my knuckles right in front of the frozen, terrified crowd. Then, the Ice King of Seoul walked me out of the ballroom, leaving the entire underworld completely, irrevocably shattered in our wake. That slap was heard around the entire world. Stephanie Jones just proved she is not a pawn. She is the queen on the board. Did you cheer when she put that heiress in her place? Tell me exactly how satisfying that moment was down in the comments. We have reached the final chapter of this incredible story. Make sure you're subscribed to Revenge Satellite and hit that notification bell right now, because we are heading into Act 6, where the Ice King's heir finally speaks, and Stephanie takes her ultimate crown. ACT 6, the crown. We didn't go back to the party. We didn't stay to watch the White Lotus syndicate cower, and we didn't stay to accept the terrified apologies of the Seoul elite. We went home. The ride back to the penthouse in the back of the armored Maybach was completely silent, but it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of captivity anymore. It was the charged, electric quiet of a kingdom that had just been fiercely, violently defended. Kang-Dae kept his massive hand wrapped tightly around mine the entire drive, his thumb rhythmically stroking the pulse point on my wrist, grounding me as the adrenaline of the night slowly began to bleed away. When the private elevator doors finally slid open, revealing the dark, polished marble of the penthouse, I let out a long, shuddering exhale. The fortress was quiet. The city of Seoul raged far below us, but up here, inside the Amethyst cage, we were entirely safe. We walked slowly down the long, dimly lit hallway toward the master suite. My custom Milan gown was heavy, the dark, vintage red wine drying into a stiff, ruined stain across the expensive silk. I stopped in the middle of the corridor, suddenly exhausted down to my very bones. Kang-Dae stopped right behind me. He didn't speak. He gently reached up, his large, calloused hands brushing my natural hair off my shoulders. With slow, agonizing care, he unclasped the heavy, multi-million-dollar diamond necklace from my throat, lifting the weight of the underworld off my skin. He set it on a passing console table like it was worthless glass. Then, his hands moved down to the hidden zipper of my ruined dress. "You defended me," I whispered into the quiet, the reality of the ballroom finally catching up to me. "You pulled a gun on a rival boss in front of the entire syndicate. For me." Kang-Dae's hands paused on my waist. He stepped closer, pressing his chest against my back, wrapping his arms securely around my stomach. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, inhaling deeply. "I told you, Stephanie." His voice was a low, vibrating rumble against my skin. "I will burn this city to the ground before I let anyone disrespect the woman who holds my heart. The dress is ruined, but the message was delivered. You are untouchable." I leaned back against his solid strength, closing my eyes, feeling completely, utterly cherished by a man the rest of the world considered a monster. But the most beautiful moment of the night wasn't the ballroom. It wasn't the diamonds, and it wasn't the kiss. The true miracle was waiting for us at the end of the hall. We walked together into Jae-hoon's room. The sterile, gray hospital walls were completely gone now, covered in our vibrant, chaotic finger-painted canvases. The room was softly illuminated by a warm, amber nightlight. I expected the little boy to be fast asleep, but as I stepped onto the thick carpet, still wearing my ruined red silk, I saw him sitting straight up in his bed. He was clutching a small, stuffed dinosaur to his chest, his dark eyes wide and fully awake. He had been waiting up for us. I immediately crossed the room, sinking down onto the edge of his mattress. Kang-Dae stood silently in the doorway, watching us with that same unguarded, raw emotion he had shown the day his son first laughed. "Hey, baby," I whispered, reaching out to softly brush the dark hair out of his eyes. "Why are you still awake? It's past midnight." Jae-hoon didn't smile. His face was intensely serious, carrying a gravity that belonged to someone much older. He looked at my ruined dress. He looked at my face, and then he slowly reached up. His tiny, warm fingers gently grabbed the edge of my silk collar. He looked me dead in the eyes, his small chest rising and falling rapidly. He hadn't spoken a single, solitary word since the day his mother was taken from him in a hail of gunfire. He had lived in a silent, terrifying world of ghosts and trauma for 2 long years. He had communicated only in tears, in panic, and recently, in bright yellow paint. He opened his mouth. His throat worked, swallowing hard as he fought past the invisible wall that had kept him trapped for so long. "Iyama." The word was raspy, it was fragile, it was barely louder than a breath of wind. "Mom," the sound broke me completely. It shattered the very last defense I had in my body. A ragged sob tore out of my throat, and tears finally spilled over my eyelashes, tracing a hot, wet path down my cheeks. I didn't care about the wine. I didn't care about the silk. I lunged forward and pulled him tightly into my chest, burying my face in his small shoulder as I wept. He wrapped his little arms around my neck, holding on to me with the exact same fierce, desperate grip he had used on that freezing Saturday in the park. From the doorway, there was a sharp, trembling intake of breath. Kang-Dae crossed the room in 2 massive strides. The Ice King of Seoul dropped to his knees right beside the bed. Tears were openly streaming down his sharp, scarred face. He wrapped his massive, heavily muscled arms completely around both of us, pulling us tightly against his chest. He buried his face in my hair, one hand clutching the back of my neck, the other firmly holding his son. We stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in the dim amber light, locking his violent, terrifying world firmly outside our heavy mahogany doors. If you are crying right now, you are not alone. The Ice King's heir finally spoke, and he chose Stephanie Jones to be his mother. This is the ultimate payoff we have been waiting for. Hit that like button if this moment completely broke you open, and tell me in the comments if you saw that emotional twist coming. Keep watching, because we are jumping forward in time to see exactly how the Queen rules her new empire. It has been exactly 1 year since that night in the ballroom. I am not a captive anymore. I am not just a broke art teacher shivering in a thrift store coat, and I am certainly not a pawn that the rival syndicates can use to get to the Ice King. The heavy, frosted glass doors of the boardroom slide open, and I step inside. I am wearing a flawlessly tailored emerald green suit. The heels of my stilettos click sharply against the polished marble floor. Behind me walk 4 massive, heavily armed guards in charcoal suits, but they aren't here to keep me from running away. They are here because I command them. Sitting at the massive mahogany table is the boss of the White Lotus syndicate, the same man whose daughter poured wine on my dress, the same faction that tried to butcher me in the alleyway. He stands up the moment I enter the room. He doesn't sneer. He doesn't mock me. He lowers his eyes and bows at a perfect, trembling 90-degree angle. I take my seat at the head of the table. I rest my hands on the dark wood, the massive, flawless diamond ring on my left hand catching the overhead lights, blinding anyone who dares to look too closely. I run a massive, multi-million-dollar charity foundation across South Korea, funded entirely by the Kang syndicate. We build art schools. We fund hospitals. We launder the dark money into light. The rival families don't laugh at me anymore. They fear me. They fear me because they know the truth. They know that if they ever cross me, if they ever threaten my son or the man who stands beside me, the Ice King will not hesitate to burn their entire bloodline to ash. Later that evening, the snow begins to fall over the city of Seoul, soft and unhurried. I stand on the balcony of our penthouse, sipping a cup of black, bitter coffee, wrapped in Kang-Dae's massive charcoal overcoat. Inside the warm, brightly lit living room, my husband is sitting on the floor in a tailored suit, his tie completely discarded, letting our son paint a bright green dinosaur across the back of his hand. I take a sip of my coffee, feeling the heat spread through my chest. They thought I was a stray dog they could kick out into the cold. They thought I was a weakness they could exploit. They didn't realize that when you save a king's bloodline from choking in the snow, you don't just get a financial reward. You get the throne. And from where I'm sitting, the view from the top of the underworld is absolutely breathtaking.